Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Randy Briner. I'm an associate professor in the Division of Exercise Physiology at WVU in the School of Medicine. I'm also the chair of the Division of Exercise Physiology, and I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to bring this introductory lecture to you entitled Energy Metabolism: Where Does Energy Come From for Muscle Contraction? So before I begin, just tell you a little bit about our program. We are, as I said, in the School of Medicine. We're one of only two programs I think you'll find specifically in schools of medicine around the country that makes us very unique. We are an excellent program for anyone who's considering a career in healthcare or health professional programs, things like medical school or dental school, physical therapy or occupational therapy, or even physician assistant programs. We have students who are matriculating into all of those programs and doing extremely well once they get in to those programs, or if you're just considering possibly getting a master's or a PhD in some type of research program, I would strongly recommend that you look at the exercise physiology program in the School of Medicine at WVU. I think you'll find it a very rewarding program, and one that will provide you with a very, very good background for those programs and get you ready for the rigors that professional school actually brings. So, without any further ado, let's go ahead and start talking about where does energy come from. So, I suspect you've had in your biology classes and other things some of this, and I'm going to try to keep it as simple as I can and straightforward because this is an introductory lecture. I do this material in a junior level course, and we get into it in much greater detail, and then in my graduate class we really get into a lot of the controlling mechanisms. But I'm just going to do an overview of where energy comes from that allows a muscle to contract. One of the other lectures that you're going to hear from three of my colleagues, is specifically about muscle contraction. You're also going to hear about how the cardiovascular system works and the respiratory system works. And all of those systems require energy. They need energy to do the things that they do, from cellular work to ion and electrical conduction, to muscle contraction. Anything that requires energy in the body, you have to ask yourself, where is it coming from? We're gonna kind of take a specific look at energy metabolism at the muscle, but please understand that this is for any work that the body does, any cellular work, any organ work, etc. So you eat, right? You eat for a purpose, and that is to get the energy from the fuels that you eat, the macronutrients, the carbohydrates, the lipids, and the proteins, and ultimately convert it to energy. But it's not a direct one-step process, as I'm sure you understand. The goal of that process is really to create this high energy compound known as adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. I again am sure you've heard about this in biology classes. ATP, as the schematic shows, is really a central molecule that you must have continuously produced to cause muscle contraction, which we'll talk about. But as Dr. Chandler talked with you about all of the things that are involved with the heart and the vasculature, ATP drives that. It drives digestion. It drives the endocrine system and all the hormones it produces, nerve transmission, etc. And this is just, again, an example of some of the things that ATP does. Think of it in the process of anything that relates to energy. As the body needs, ATP must be central to that. Now, the potential energy for ATP, as I said, is really used for all of these processes. And so how does that work? Well, and what is ATP? Well, ATP is formed from a molecule of adenine, which is a nitrogenous base, and it binds to the sugar ribose and it forms adenosine. And adenosine binds to 3 inorganic phosphates. And I like the way the schematic is showing you. Notice that the bonds, especially of these outer 2 phosphates, are kind of lit up in this schematic because these are considered high energy phosphate bonds. It is the energy that's stored in these bonds that once you break it can be released to cause the stuff that you're looking at on the process. So the goal is to always have ATP available. Now let me just digress for a second and tell you that studies have shown, things that have meticulously been able to measure the phosphate content of a muscle, for example, have shown that ATP is stored in very, very small quantities. And one might ask, well, why is that? True, shouldn't it be stored in high quantities if the body relies on it so much? Well, as we'll talk about in a second, biologists and biochemists believe that it's actually advantageous for the cell to have very, very small quantities, because as soon as it begins to break down, as soon as you start cleaving these bonds off, enzymatic reactions, when this is occurring within milliseconds, start the process of resynthesis of ATP, and that's actually what we're going to talk about. Okay, so when you think about ATP and its breakdown, you think about that in the presence of water. So it's called ATP hydrolysis. And through enzymatic reactions, okay, ATPase, all right, and you probably again have learned this in your biology class, put ASC at the end of many of these molecules and you get the enzyme that actually breaks down the substrate, and this is a perfect example of that. When ATP begins to break down in the presence of water, you get ADP, inorganic phosphate, and energy. Now, in vitro measures, or in a test tube measure, okay, studies have shown that gives you approximately 7.3 kilocalories per mole of ATP. Notice down here, and I always remind my students, we're not a test tube. We're actually a living organism. So in vivo measures have actually determined that the hydrolysis of ATP really gives a little bit more energy than you see in a test tube. That's probably closer to 10 to 11 kilocalories per mole. Now, before I leave this, I want you to kind of notice a couple things about this reaction. Oxygen is not required for this process to take place. So we're going to define this process as an anaerobic process, a process that does not require oxygen, okay? And because energy is released from this process, the reaction is said to be exergonic, okay? You're giving up energy. So exergonic reactions are reactions that free energy to their surrounding. They're considered negative because the potential energy is going down, but that is because energy is going to drive biological work. Okay, endergonic reactions require energy. So if you were looking at the reaction, you would see that the free energy is a positive number. And I don't want to go off onto that tangent. That's beyond the scope of this lecture. But just keep in mind that exergonic and endergonic reactions are always working together in biology. Something is being broken down so it can donate the energy to something else that needs it. Okay, so that's the easiest way to keep that, that concept in mind. This schematic kind of shows that. So if you think about those of you who may lift weights and are trying to build muscle, right? That is an anabolic process. The building of muscle tissue requires a lot of energy put into the system, right? That process of synthesizing muscle, okay, is an endergonic or an anabolic process. So where does that energy come from? Well, it comes from the hydrolysis of ATP, right? So as you break ATP down into ADP and inorganic phosphate, it's donating the energy for this anabolic process. Well, notice that this needs to be a cyclic process. You need to continuously, as you're breaking ATP down, you got to resynthesize it. And how does that happen? Well, it happens through the exergonic or catabolism mechanisms of breaking your macronutrients down, carbohydrates, fats, and in some situations, proteins. Okay, most of this takes place with the help of oxygen, but notice that this does not require oxygen. So this is an immediate, within millisecond reaction that can take place, and as soon as this is broken down, and this is the last thing I want to say about this, again, biochemists have looked at the energy charge of the muscle to try to determine how are these processes being controlled or governed. And it really comes down to something very, very simple. It is the ratio of ATP to ADP. This ratio changes the energy charge, and as it does, it activates enzymes that allow this process to continue. So as long as this cyclic process can take place, you stay alive. When this process stops is when you're no longer part of the living. Okay, so important to understand again what exergonic and endergonic processes are, and how that really is nothing more than building things and breaking things down in a cyclic process that ATP seems to be centrally governing. Okay. All right, so when you're thinking about this, and as I said, ATP is stored in very, very small quantities within the cell. So as soon as ATP begins to be broken down, there must be things that are available to resynthesize it. So what's the very first process the cell chooses to use to resynthesize another ATP? Well, it does it by tapping into other high energy phosphate molecules that are found within the muscle. One of those high energy phosphates is creatine phosphate. Now, some of you may be advocates of GNC or other places where you can buy nutrient supplies, and so you've probably seen creatine powder and other things, other forms of creatine being sold, and you've probably wondered, well, I wonder what that's for. Does that actually really work? Is it worth spending my money on? Well, the answer is yes and no. Okay, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But I wanted to show you exactly what creatine phosphate is actually doing. So the first thing to tell you is that creatine phosphate is actually considered has a higher energy of phosphorylation or free energy potential than ATP. Okay, and there is actually 4 to 6 times more creatine phosphate stored in the muscle. But again, when you're thinking about how much ATP there is, I said it's very small quantity, so this isn't a lot, it's just more than ATP. But it's a very, very powerful high energy phosphate that can momentarily help to resynthesize an ATP molecule. Okay, so how does it do it? Well, when you begin, let's just say you're an athlete and you contract that muscle for the first time. So you lift a weight or you start a sprint or whatever it is, that muscle must contract. As I said, through the hydrolysis of ATP, that immediate energy is supplied by that ATP that's stored in the muscle. So this ratio instantly changes. And again, this is under the influence of adenosine triphosphate, the enzyme that does this. So as this ratio changes, it activates another enzyme, creatine phosphokinase. That actually then breaks down the phosphocreatine and donates its energy to an ADP, allowing an ATP molecule to be formed. And this process is cyclic again, and again, we don't have time to talk about how all the creatine phosphate is reformed. It's through a mitochondrial process, and you'll see in a minute why the mitochondria is important. But suffice it to say that for those first few seconds of physical activity, this process right here collectively provides almost all the energy your muscle cell needs. Okay, this graph here is really to make the point of what I was just saying, that when you begin to contract a muscle, these high energy phosphates represented here in the blue are the primary source that the muscle is relying on for energy. But notice that, and I always tell this to students, the systems that we are about to talk about over the next few minutes are not exclusive. You don't have to use one up to get to the next to get to the next. Notice that all three systems that we are about to talk about begin to start at the very beginning of muscle contraction. All right, so the first system is the high energy phosphates, ATP, creatine phosphate are examples. Then you get into the use, as you'll see in a minute, of carbohydrates through glycolysis. Okay, this is a process that doesn't require oxygen. And then you finally get into all of the processes that require oxygen, and you can see that there's a different time course here. Okay, the high energy phosphates are used fastest, followed by the anaerobic processes that use glucose or carbohydrates, followed then all of them are starting at the same time, but you can see the time course is much more slow in the oxidative systems. But notice over time, and this is only after what, 1 minute, 2 minutes, the oxidative processes take over primarily, not exclusively, but primarily. So anything that requires continued muscle contraction of all-out effort more than 10 seconds, or if you're going to do something a little bit more modest but for longer periods of time, you have to get into other processes that resynthesize ATP outside of these high energy phosphate molecules. Okay, so what does that lead us to? That leads us to the conversation of the fuels that you consume in your diet, the macronutrients, right? Your carbohydrates, your fats, and your proteins. The primary source or purpose of those is to be used for energy. Okay, so now let's talk about the first one, and that is carbohydrates. Now, carbohydrates seem to get a really bad rap, and medical circles nowadays, and I understand why. Okay, I study obesity. I've done a lot of research with obesity, and it's a terrible plague that affects our state and our country and our world, and it leads to so many other pathologies, diabetes and heart disease and atherosclerosis, etc., etc. So there is some truth to the fact that we eat too many carbs, but we eat the wrong carbs. We eat too much simple sugars, right? And that does lead to a lot of the obesity problems that we have. But when you think about exercise and you think about what the muscle is relying on for that, let's take another turn. Let's not think about the clinical side of this as far as obesity goes. Let's think about it as far as what the muscle is really needing and demanding. Of the three macronutrients, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, carbs are by far the most important. By far. You must always have a constant supply of carbohydrates if you want that muscle to continue to contract. When the carbohydrate availability to a muscle ceases, you will fatigue. End of story. So it's quite important that you understand why carbs are always talked about first. And we as exercise physiologists, although we do work with dietitians and we try to help people have a modest intake of carbs, when people are exercising, we really push the complex carbohydrates and a constant supply of those carbs to the muscle, especially if you are using exercise as part of a weight loss program. Okay. I don't want to, diverge too far down into that clinical side of things. Come to our program and we'll have a series of lectures on that. But let's just talk about carbs and how it's used for energy. The primary source of for ATP resynthesis, especially in those first few minutes of exercise, is carbohydrate metabolism, because carbohydrates are the only macronutrients that can give you ATP without the use of oxygen or anaerobic. Okay, and that's very important during very heavy exercise, when you're sprinting at the end, at the beginning of exercise, when it takes a little bit of time for the cardiovascular system to fully oxygenate that muscle, etc. Okay, now I just want to kind of momentarily talk about where we are in the cell, because sometimes it's hard for students to see what we're talking about and really kind of get a picture. So let's keep it simple. Here's kind of a schematic of your cell, and there are two areas that I want you to focus on. The liquid portion of the cell, known as the cytosol or the cytoplasm, and then these organelles known as the mitochondria. And many of you, if you've studied this, probably have heard them called the powerhouse of the cell. Okay, so in these two areas, all energy metabolism takes place. And so the easiest way to keep this simple is anything that I have talked about or will talk about in an anaerobic context, or in processes that are giving you ATP without the need of oxygen, they take place in the cytosol. Any of the processes that require oxygen to allow ATP to be formed, that takes place in the mitochondria. So we've already talked about our high energy phosphates. We're going to talk about glucose and its storage form, which is glycogen. We're going to talk about a process known as gluconeogenesis, and that is the creation of a glucose molecule from another source, like glycerol, which comes from fats, right? Triglycerides. All of that process that can give you ATP takes place in the cytosol. When you metabolize a glucose molecule fully, or when you use fats, or when you use proteins for energy, that must take place in the mitochondria. All right, so let's go back, kind of re-pick up where we were talking about it as far as carbohydrates go. There are two stages that I want you to think about when it comes to the use of a glucose molecule. Okay, glucose is just your sugar. So if you eat carbohydrates, the body will, through the metabolism processes, will convert that to glucose. Glucose is one of the most tightly controlled physiological processes that you have in your body. You must always have a normal blood glucose level, because when it falls, a condition known as hypoglycemia, the brain is not very happy, because the brain relies almost exclusively on glucose for energy. So when you become hypoglycemic, you become very disoriented, and you can eventually pass out if it gets too low. So the brain is always going to rely on a constant supply of glucose. Okay, so important that you understand what this molecule is. It is what we will define as our carbohydrate that the body is using. All right, how do you use glucose for energy? Well, you do so in two processes. One does not require oxygen, and one requires oxygen. Now notice on this slide, next to the anaerobic, or the non-oxygenated term, I have fast, and next to the oxygenated term, I have slow. It is important that you understand that in a healthy cell, in most of us as we are exercising, there is rarely a time when the cell doesn't have plenty of oxygen. Now, I know Louis Pasteur was a genius, and he discovered a long time ago that if you put glucose in a test tube and you sucked out all the oxygen and you combusted it, you can get energy and you end up with lactic acid, and that's absolutely true. Okay, but you need to understand that that is not what's happening most of the time when you exercise. The only time I can think of when the cell actually becomes truly anaerobic or without oxygen is if you're lifting really, really heavy weights and you're doing it long enough to squeeze the blood supply off, and so momentarily you're going to have that. Now, obviously that's true in a pathological condition. So during like a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, that is where a blood vessel actually gets clotted up, so everything downstream from it there's no more blood going to it, so the cells, to stay alive momentarily, have to rely on anaerobic processes. But please understand that there's rarely a time, and I know some of you who are listening to this are probably very elite athletes. Some of you may be runners, and you exercise at a very high volume and a very high intensity. I can tell you studies have shown that your muscles are highly oxygenated during that process. The issue is, how much energy are you demanding at that time, and do you need it very fast, so therefore you're going to get it from this process, or can you rely on it a little bit more slow, therefore you get it from this process? Okay, so I just wanted to kind of make sure I talked about that, because so often students in beginning energy metabolism assume that anaerobic means the cell has no oxygen, and that is absolutely not the case. Okay, so during the fast or the without oxygen necessary reactions, we can use glucose directly. We can lyse it, we can break it down, and we call that glycolysis. All right, so that's if you take a glucose molecule from your blood directly into the muscle, and it goes directly into the metabolic pathway we're about to talk about. However, most of the time during physical activity, especially of higher intensity, you don't use the blood glucose, and I'm going to show you this in a little bit and explain why this is true. You really rely on what was already stored there. So if you take glucose into the cell, say at nighttime you're eating, or after you've exercised or whatever, and you're at rest, much of that glucose will bind together and form a molecule called glycogen. Glycogen is just the storage form of glucose. Just a bunch of glucose is bound together. When you start with that process, we call it glycogenolysis. All right, it's the same process, it's just one step different. All right, you're ultimately getting to the point where you're breaking glucose down for energy, and as I said, the initial steps do not require oxygen, even though the cell has plenty of it to go around. All right, so without boring you and getting into too great detail, this is the glycolytic pathway. And again, just to remind you, we are in the cytoplasm, the cytosol, okay, the liquid portion of the cell. So let's pretend this blue up here is the bloodstream, and you just brought this glucose molecule into the cell, okay? In order to start the process by getting ATP, we actually have to give an ATP. Notice the very first enzyme, hexokinase, actually helps to attach a phosphate to this glucose. Now, why that's important is because there's very, very little free glucose floating around in your cells. It either comes in, and if you're at rest, you build a glycogen molecule, or if you're not at rest and you need energy, you phosphorylate it and off it goes down the glycolytic pathway. But that requires energy to do this. Okay, so we actually have to put energy in to get energy out of our carbohydrate or our glucose molecule. Notice at step 3, another energy requiring step is shown here. Right? Phosphofructokinase is another enzyme, and it's important to understand that when you're breaking glucose down, all you're doing is changing it from one substrate to the next, okay? And each of these steps are governed by an enzyme, okay? You guys probably know that an enzyme is just a protein catalyst. You don't have to have it there, but the cell won't survive because the processes will go so slow that they're almost non-functional. So an enzyme speeds this reaction up several thousand times. One of the cool things about phosphofructokinase, it's said that of all the steps you're about to see in this slide and the next slide, phosphofructokinase seems to be the rate limiting enzyme of all of those. It's the weak link. So if you think of a string of pearls and you pull on it real hard and it snaps at one part, it snaps at the weak link. That is what biochemists believe phosphofructokinase is, because it's considered a multivalent allosteric enzyme. Again, that's just a fancy word to say that because it's a protein structures can change, right? And it can change by by different things like temperature and pH and substrate availability. And this thing changes a lot, and it can either change to make this reaction go faster, or it can change to make it go slower. That's why it's considered the rate limiting enzyme. But keep it simple, guys. In order to use glucose for energy, you must actually give energy up in two different steps. So by the time we get to the substrate fructose 1,6-diphosphate, we're already 2 ATP in the hole. Okay, so with that being said, here's our fructose 1,6-diphosphate. And notice, and by the way, I apologize, let me go back here for a second. How many carbons is a glucose molecule? It's a 6 carbon, right? C6H12O6. That's what glucose is. And fructose or glucose 6-phosphate is 6 carbon, fructose 6-phosphate is 6, fructose 1,6-diphosphate is 6. Okay, until you get down to the step where you convert it to a 3-phosphoglyceraldehyde. Now it's a 3 carbon molecule. So the way the artist is doing this and is showing, and I always tell the students I like this picture because it reminds you that for each glucose molecule you actually get 2 3-phosphoglyceraldehydes. 2 of these, right? Why that is important is because now as we begin to go down and convert it from one substrate to the next, notice that there are steps where ATP are formed. Okay, enough energy is released from this substrate converted to this substrate, and you directly can form an ATP. Notice that occurs in step 7 and step 10, but because this happens twice, because you get 2 of these, that's a 3 carbon molecule, right, from your 6 carbon glucose, there is 1, 2, 3, 4 net ATP produced. But remember, we had to use 2 in the beginning, so this again is all in the cytosol. This is all anaerobic. The anaerobic breakdown of glucose gives you 4 ATP or a net 2. Okay. Now, one other thing I want to show you, and this is it gets very complicated, and I don't want to get too complicated in this process, but notice at step 6 that there's an enzyme called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase. Dehydrogenase enzymes are enzymes that can actually cleave pairs of proteins with their high energy electrons off the substrate that they're acting on. Okay, well, if you've taken chemistry, you may remember that you can't have hydrogens just floating around because it's going to change the pH. So these hydrogens are actually picked up by coenzymes. Okay, and I'm going to define this for you in a second, but coenzymes that are part of this. Now I know that's now really getting into the weeds for some of you, but really it's really cool, and you'll see a picture of this in a second. Most energy in the fuels that you eat to resynthesize ATP are actually coming in these high energy molecules that are being picked up and shuttled someplace, and then this picture says it's going to the electron transport, which I'll show you in a minute. Okay, last thing I want to show you about this process is notice from glucose metabolism that we convert it to both, and that's the key, pyruvate and lactate. Now I know if you've exercised, you've heard of lactic acid, and I know that you've probably heard, oh, the lactate burn, oh, lactic acid is terrible, oh, it makes my body hurt. Well, there's a little truth to it, but I want you to understand that lactate or lactic acid is actually a very, very important intermediate of carbohydrate metabolism. So when you use glucose or your carbohydrates, you're getting both of these, and it really depends on how fast glycolysis is occurring, which one dictates where you see the most. Do you see more pyruvate and a little bit of lactic acid, or do you see more lactic acid and a little bit of pyruvate? The faster this goes, the more of this you produce. But please understand that this goes both ways. So any lactic acid that you form, you can actually resynthesize it back to pyruvate. And this is kind of just showing you a schematic of what I'm talking about. Remember I said something about Louis Pasteur and his genius, and people think that the only reason you get lactic acid is because the cell has no oxygen. And I told you that's absolutely not true. That is just not a true statement when it comes to a normal muscle cell. You are always producing lactic acid. You're producing it right now while you're listening to me. Maybe in little quantities, it's just being used as fast as you produce it for energy. Lactic acid is a very, very important molecule to the cell. It gives you energy, but it comes solely by this anaerobic glycolysis process, right? Doesn't matter whether oxygen is there or not, you're still going to produce it, right? You're going to get the pyruvic acid, and then remember I showed you in that one step where hydrogens were being pumped out on step 6, right? And they were being picked up by those coenzymes. Well, one of the things the coenzymes do is they take those hydrogens and they donate it to this enzyme, lactate dehydrogenase. Guess what this does? It produces lactic acid. So lactic acid is formed not because the cell doesn't have any oxygen. It's formed simply through the process of rapid glycolysis. See, the goal of this guy here, so this is in the oxidized state, and this is the reduced state, right? That just simply means it's either without the hydrogens or it has the hydrogens. Its real goal is to carry it over here to the mitochondria. But if it doesn't have time to do that, okay, or if this is going real fast, another easy thing for it to do is to never leave this vicinity, come down here and throw those hydrogens on lactate dehydrogenase and come back up here and get more. See, you got to have this all the time, okay? Let me back one step. See this right here? In order for this step to go to here, you must have this guy oxidized or without hydrogens, because once it has the hydrogen it can't pick up another one, and when all of these things are full, this can occur, and then you do start seeing the pH of this area start to go down. It becomes more acidic, right? And then phosphofructokinase is negatively affected and this process will slow down. Okay, so I just wanted to show you what lactic acid, where it comes from. And remember, when you form lactic acid, when this process goes slow, then it can be converted back here. So really, when you think about it, lactic acid is really a cool thing, because one of the things studies have shown is that here's your muscle. That's where we were just looking at it. You produce that you take a glucose molecule. This is known as the glucose paradox. A paradox is something that doesn't make sense. And in this case, the paradox is you use glucose to get glucose. Well, how's that taking place? Well, here's your muscle. It's active. It's contracting real fast. It's taking up glucose. It's converting it to pyruvate and lactate. And some of the lactate is ending up in your blood. Much of that then circulates in the vascular system and is taken up by the liver. Well, notice what the liver can do. It's very, very efficient at reconverting it back to pyruvate, and it actually has the enzymes that can go upstream of glycolysis. So the pyruvate then can convert glucose, all right, and it can either be stored as glycogen after your exercise, or it can be dumped back into arterial system, right? And then there it is, and it goes back in. So this is a big cyclic process. This process is known as gluconeogenesis, okay? That is, if you think about neogenesis, it's creating glucose from a non-glucose source. The non-glucose source is lactate, okay? All right. So in essence, I just kind of want to summarize lactic acid, because I know there's so much misnomer out there that lactic acid is a bad thing and you never want it produced. And there are multitudes of studies that show that's not true, and it's a very, very important energetic process. We just talked about number 3. It can be used by the liver as a gluconeogenic precursor, okay? But it can also be used by that actual cell itself. Remember, I showed you where it can be reconverted back to pyruvate, and in a second I'm going to show you where pyruvate then is used. Or when you look at the bundle, if you look at your muscle, you have slow twitch and fast twitch fibers that sit next to each other. Now, I believe probably in Dr. Pastilli's lecture, he'll talk a little bit more about those, so I don't want to really go into, but slow twitch are used in postural types of processes. They're also used in slower activities where fast twitch are activated when you sprint and power things. Well, you produce a lot more lactic acid in a fast twitch fiber and less in a slow twitch fiber. Slow twitch fibers have more mitochondria. Do you remember what I said the importance of the mitochondria is? That is where the oxidative systems take place. So much of the lactic acid that's produced by your muscle, especially fast twitch, goes out of the fast twitch into the slow twitch, and then it's used for energy. So suffice it to say, from now on, I want you to think when you're working out, yeah, lactic acid may make you fatigue a little bit, but it is an amazingly important energy substrate that the muscle can use in several different ways. Okay, so let's just pick up where we left off. So we talked about glycolysis. So again, we start with a glucose or glycogen in the cytosol, and through a series of 10 or 11 reactions that I just showed you, you're going to end up with both pyruvate and lactic acid. Whether it's the direct pyruvate or lactic acid that gets reconverted back to pyruvate, there it is right there. Now, this process, this white, is all taking place in the mitochondria. So remember, we had glucose. Let's just, again, review. Start with glucose from the blood, take the glucose into the muscle, convert it to pyruvate in the cytosol, and then through a carrier-mediated process. Okay, it's very complex, don't have time for it here, but we get it into the mitochondria, which is a double-walled organelle that's found all throughout your cell. That is where all energy metabolism or all oxidative processes take place. So there's the pyruvate. Again, this is a 3-carbon molecule. So we form 2 of these, right, for every glucose molecule. Now, this is a very busy slide, and you obviously probably don't have to know this now. I don't know if your chemistry teachers are going to make you know it, but notice that pyruvate becomes decarboxylated, or you take one of the 3 carbons off, you form CO2, and you form the 2-carbon acetyl-CoA molecule. All right, that acetyl-CoA goes into what's known as the citric acid or the Krebs cycle. Citric acid, the name comes from the fact that the first intermediate is citrate. Okay, so we convert this, see, oxalacetate binds with acetyl-CoA and you form citrate. Now again, don't get all hung up on all of the enzymes and all the things. Notice, even though this isn't a pure cycle, what's its purpose? The purpose is to take this 2-carbon molecule, form citrate, and through a series of enzymatic reactions starts doing stuff, right? One of the things is forming 1 ATP directly. Now it's a GTP, but energetically it's an ATP. But really what you're getting, notice at this step, at this step, and this step, you're spitting out pairs of hydrogens. Remember I talked about the importance through dehydrogenase enzymes. And you have these coenzymes that are part of these dehydrogenase enzymes, picking them up and ultimately taking them to the mitochondria. This is where most energy takes place, or taking them to the inner part of the mitochondria. We're already in the mitochondria. Okay. All right, so let's just kind of again review real quick. I don't want to belabor this point, but here's your cell, here's the mitochondria, here it is blown up. Notice it's a double walled. You have the outer membrane and you have this inner membrane, okay, right? So when you look at, here's the cytosol. All right, so here is glycolysis. You take the pyruvate and you suck it into the mitochondria. There it is, right? Pyruvate from glycolysis. You convert it. You take a carbon off of it. you form acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA goes into that cyclic cycle, and what's its purpose? Yep, you get 1 ATP, but its big claim to fame is spitting out these hydrogens. And I love the way the artist shows this. Why? Because all of these hydrogens are taken to the top of this cylinder in this picture, which is the electron transport, because hydrogens have electrons on them. And through the process of it just spinning down through here, that's where almost all ATP comes from. And notice what's sitting at the bottom right there. Oxygen, molecular oxygen. This is the only place that oxygen actually takes place in this whole energetic milieu, right? The only place is serving as the final electron acceptor that is coming from all hydrogens going down this cylinder. Okay, so I've talked about the importance of these dehydrogenase enzymes through all of this. And again, this is just enzymes that can catalyze or break down a substrate and release hydrogens with their high energy electrons from your nutrients, from the carbs and your fats that you eat. Okay, because they are releasing these protons, something must pick them up. You just can't let them sit there, or the pH is going to change. So part of these this is actually a complex. It's not just the enzyme. It has a coenzyme bound to it, and the coenzyme actually can bind these hydrogens. The two coenzymes that we always talk about in energy metabolism are nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. This is a niacin-based product. So when you think about, when dietitians and nutritionists talk about the importance of your B complex vitamins for energy metabolism, they are telling you the truth. There's a lot of things it does. One of them is forming the base of these coenzymes that can pick up these protons. So notice that NAD can be in the oxidized state or without the protons right here, and it can be in the reduced state. It actually binds to one of the two. The other one is flavin adenine dinucleotide, or a riboflavin derived coenzyme. Unlike NAD, it can actually pick up both of the protons. Now, I know this gets really into the weeds and sometimes students' heads start spinning. Keep it simple, guys. This is just taking the food you eat, and through a series of enzymatic reactions, you are cleaving it from one substrate to the next substrate to the next substrate, and in the process, little things are happening. Sometimes there's enough energy that's being released that you can directly synthesize an ATP, but that happens very little compared to these dehydrogenase enzymes cleaving off these protons with their high energy electrons, being picked up by these coenzyme factors of these enzymes and being carried or shuttled someplace. And where they're being shuttled to is the inner part of the mitochondria. Now, this is just a schematic. You guys, I think, can appreciate what a waterfall looks like. All right, so think about Niagara Falls or any of the types of big waterfalls that you've seen before. And as the water goes over that waterfall, there's a lot of potential energy in that water because of its spatial orientation, because it's very high and it's falling, and as it's falling, that potential energy, that kinetic energy, can actually be harnessed if you actually had a water wheel there to have it turn into potential energy, or energy that could actually do some work, right? So you can see that makes sense. So let's say you have this big giant waterfall and you put 3 turbines in it, right? And as the water is going over, it's spinning this, so the kinetic energy is converted to potential energy, which is converted to work, in this case electric power. That is exactly what's happening on the inner part of your mitochondria with this electron transport. This is the same picture you were just looking at, just a little bit more complex, okay? But notice that NAD, all right, and it's carrying these protons in here. It's dumping them to these cytochromes. These are iron protein molecules that can accept electrons and continue to pass them down this waterfall. So they come in at a higher potential energy, going to a lower potential energy, but in the process, they can actually release enough energy to spin those turbines, so to speak, and form ATP. This is where most ATP takes place. Now notice that NADH comes in at a higher energy potential than FADH. So NADH can turn 3 of the turbines where FADH can only turn 2 of the turbines. That's why we see this. You can see that it can give you 3 ATP where FADH only gives you 2. Again, I know this is beyond the scope of what you need to know, but I'm just trying to help you see where energy comes from. And again, notice what you have at the very bottom. What's sitting down there collecting all of these electrons? It's oxygen. This is the only place oxygen is needed. However, if you don't have this, this all backs up and the process comes to a screeching halt. So oxygen will collect these electrons as they pass down. It will bind to a pair of these protons that NADH or NADH is bringing in, and guess what it forms, right? Water. So one of the byproducts of energy metabolism is the formation of water. Okay, so just again, I keep going back because I think it's important for students in beginning metabolism to keep in mind where we're talking about in the cell. So here's our cell again, here's our mitochondria. Notice that I said it's a double-walled organelle, and what the artist is doing is saying, okay, let's look at this inner mitochondria. Okay, this inner membrane, and let's yank out a piece, and there it is right there. So really, how are we resynthesizing ATP? Remember, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, has these high energy phosphates that are bound to it. How do we resynthesize it? Well, we've got to put energy into it. Where's the energy coming from? It is coming primarily because of this electron transport and the process of this proton gradient. You have way more protons on the inner membrane space, this area right here, than you do deep within the mitochondria, this matrix right here. And this gradient forms this electrochemical process by which in essence, it's just creating an energy field. Just think it like that. And the energy field, I could show you multiple pictures and we can get into this really in a complex way. Don't go there. All you have to know is that this energy field is used to jam a phosphate onto an ADP. Okay, that energy field then is captured in that bond so that when you break it the next time, it's released to do work. So that is where, when you eat carbohydrates or fats, and we'll talk about fat in a second, that's how the energy for ATP resynthesis is primarily coming from. Okay, so what is this whole process called? Well, we call this oxidative phosphorylation. Now again, that's a fancy name for nothing more than using molecular oxygen to rephosphorylate an ADP. And this is all the things that I was just talking about in the process. This is where you transfer these protons and their electrons from our coenzyme factors of our dehydrogenase enzymes, ultimately passing the electrons to molecular oxygen, and we form ATP. And notice that more than 90% of ATP synthesis comes through this process. All right, so these are two separate processes that are coupled together through the use of molecular oxygen and forming that energy field, that proton gradient. We can rephosphorylate an ATP. All right, so what really generally do you call this? You call this aerobic metabolism. So the next time you're working out with somebody and you're like, okay, you want to do some aerobic workouts, I want you to tell them, let me tell you exactly what aerobic metabolism is. It is the process of coupled or together oxidative phosphorylation with oxygen serving as the final electron and proton acceptor. That's what aerobic metabolism is. Okay, oxygen has one purpose, but it's a very important one. All right, so then just to summarize, when you think about this whole thing, you start with glucose, you end up with 2 pyruvates. We said you form 2 ATP, but it's really a net of 2. We had on step 6 where there was a dehydrogenase enzyme, so you picked those up and you took those to the electron transport. Some of it went and bound to lactate dehydrogenase, but the majority of it is being taken to the inner mitochondrial membrane and passed on to those cytochromes, right? So you took the pyruvate and you took it into the mitochondria and you converted it to acetyl-CoA, right? You formed CO2, and that step did the exact same thing, right? Notice all of these steps are relying on these coenzyme factors. And finally, you took the acetyl-CoA and you put it into this cyclic process we call the citric acid cycle. And for each glucose molecule, remember, this occurs twice, right? For each glucose, you get 2 pyruvate, 2 acetyl-CoA, cycles of this, right? So you get 2 of these, and you get all of these crazy things over here that you don't even need to. You can sit there and kind of look at it if you want, kind of study it, but at the end of the day, the goal is to produce ATP. So for each glucose, the net ATP is 32. Old textbooks always referred this number to 36. You'll see that in textbooks and other sources. There's probably a gross 36, but biochemists believe that net number because there's other processes, like you got to shuttle the stuff into the mitochondria and all that requires energy. The net of breaking a glucose down is 32. Okay, it doesn't really matter. I just wanted you to see where all this came from. All right, couple things just before I leave carbohydrate metabolism. Let's just talk about how the body actually uses it during physical activity. This is a neat study because this was looking at the arterial venous glucose difference in a working muscle. How much glucose was going into the muscle versus how much stayed in the blood as it went out the veins. Okay, and you can see that during the first 10 minutes, whether the person was just hardly pedaling at about a 50 to 60% effort, or really pedaling almost all out, you can see that in the first 10 minutes that there is an increase in muscle uptake of glucose, and it was intensity dependent. The harder you did it, the more glucose you took up. I think that makes sense. But notice what happens after about 10 minutes. That starts to plateau. Now it does go up slightly, but not nearly as fast as it did at the beginning. Why is that? Well, remember I said the brain has to rely on a constant supply of glucose. If this graph actually had this type of curve and you just continued it up, your body would become hypoglycemic very quickly and you would fatigue very quickly. So actually the muscle has taught itself, and there's a whole bunch of processes we don't have time to talk about, and you can learn if you take some of our courses, but it's actually taught itself not to take as much glucose as it potentially could and leave a lot of it in the blood so that the brain can stay happy. Now, if that's true, the muscle is still working at a very high intensity, so you must ask yourself, okay, if you're not getting it mostly from blood glucose, where are you getting it? Well, that comes down to the process of what you eat, especially what you eat prior to exercise. Now, some of you have probably heard of carbohydrate loading, and that's what marathon runners and other endurance athletes do before a big race. They'll eat a lot of spaghetti, or they'll eat a lot of carbohydrate containing products, because what they're trying to do is get as much glucose into the muscle and into the liver and store it as glycogen, so then when they exercise they have that storage stuff right there in the muscle. Because as I told you, and I just showed you in the previous slide, it's not blood glucose that your muscle relies on primarily at a high intensity. It's the glycogen that's actually there, and the glycogen that's stored in the liver that can be then converted to glucose and carried to the muscle. And if you don't believe me, look at this cool study. This is looking at exercise time in individuals who ate a lot of carbs before they exercise versus those who purposely depleted their carbohydrate intake prior to exercise. And notice even at the very beginning of physical activity, this is exercise intensity. How much could they maintain? They all started at about 70 to 75%, but notice right away the carbohydrate depleted individuals, their intensity started going down, 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 down. So you could imagine if this was a race, who's going to win, right? So starting in a carbohydrate depleted state will always hurt your ability to contract your muscle at a high level. All right, so again, it gets back to the thing I was telling you about the importance of carbohydrates in your diet. And again, this is just looking at it one more different way. This study looked at the initial amount of stored glucose in your muscle, the initial glycogen level. So they had people who ate a high fat diet and a low carb diet, right? Then they had people who ate just a normal amount of carbs. All right, so what the RDA recommends versus those who ate a high carbohydrate diet. You can see that obviously the diet had a profound effect on the initial muscle glycogen level. All right, the amount of glycogen in grams per 100 grams of muscle tissue. Okay, the higher you had, the longer you lasted in an exercise bout till you fatigued. So again, please understand that if you are exercising, your body has to have carbohydrates, because when you have depleted these, I don't care how much fat you have or how much protein, you will fatigue. Okay? All right. Now that leads us, then we're going to just kind of wrap this up and talk a little bit about fat and a tiny bit about protein. But fat is a very, very important energy substrate, especially for an endurance athlete, because it is by far the most potential stored energy we have in our body. And again, I always tell students, don't memorize these numbers, but just kind of conceptually understand it. The average person, and I'm not talking about an obese person, I'm talking about those of you who are listening to this who are very, very fit. You still store between 60 and 100,000 kilocalories of energy as fat. And even if you are eating a lot of carbs, notice what you can store, about 2% of that. Now what's interesting is, as I said, and I always tell my students, you have to always have carbohydrates to keep exercising. And so we don't have a whole bunch of it. And yeah, you can be taking some Gatorade and you can be taking some stuff to help with this. But what really is advantageous is to train the muscle to rely on using fat so it can conserve the carbohydrates so you last longer. And that's exactly what training does. It allows the cell to preferentially use fat at certain periods of time, and I'll show that to you in a second. All right, so where does most fat come from? Well, you probably understand it comes from fat cells or your adipose tissue. The large majority of what we store as energy is actually directly as triglyceride molecules. Tri means 3, right? So you have a glycerol backbone and 3 long chain fatty acids that are right there in the fat. And through a series of enzymatic reactions, just like glycolysis, one of those is hormone sensitive lipase ASE. Again, that is one of the main enzymes that breaks down triglycerides, and it breaks it down into fatty acids and glycerol, and it dumps it into the bloodstream, and both can then circulate to the muscle and be used as energy. Notice what these fats can be converted to: acetyl-CoA. Where have you seen that before? From glucose metabolism. So it doesn't matter whether the cell gets acetyl-CoA from a carbohydrate source or a fat source. It's all the same, and it all ends up in the citric acid cycle and ultimately the electron transport to form ATP. Okay, so just go back up here real quick. we have a whole series of lectures on the endocrine system and how it controls all of metabolism. This is called hormone sensitive, so obviously it must be sensitive to particular hormones, and those hormones and examples of those are epinephrine and norepinephrine, or you may know them as adrenaline and noradrenaline. You know, up during exercise or during stressful periods of time. Same thing with growth hormone. Growth hormone is also known to be able to activate this, and it goes up with long duration physical activity. So that enzyme gets turned on by some of these hormones that are released when you exercise, and it allows this fat to be broken down, and then it binds to albumin, most of it, and it circulates to the muscle, and it's used for energy. Now this is just a schematic. Again, you may have not had nutrition yet, and again, I always tell students, beginning students, keep it as simple as you can. A triglyceride molecule is nothing more than this glycerol backbone and three long carbon chain molecules. You see, and just like how glucose was broken down in the presence of water, so is triglycerides, and hormone sensitive lipase through the process can cleave off these long carbon chains. So you take one off and now you have a glycerol, you take two off and now you have a monosyl glycerol. Or at the very end, what you want in this triglyceride molecule is you want to break it down into the glycerol backbone in three of these long chain fatty acids. Each of these then go out of the fat, are bound to albumin, taken to the muscle, and can be used for energy. Now, without getting into the whole metabolic processes, I don't want to do it as nearly as detailed as I did for glycolysis. I do want to say that that process is known as beta oxidation, and beta oxidation actually takes place in the inner part of the mitochondria where oxygen is present, because the process of using fats, you have to do it with oxygen. You cannot do it anaerobically. Beta oxidation is nothing more than taking a pair of scissors. If this is your long chain, each of these are carbons, and you got your hydrogen bound to it. You have your carboxyl group on one end, and then the next carbon is called the alpha carbon, and the next carbon is called the beta carbon. You're just taking a pair of scissors and you're cutting it between the alpha and the beta carbon. So you're forming two carbon fragments. The scissors then jumps over here, jumps over here, jumps over here, etc., etc. So depending on how long this is, you just keep cutting it into two carbon fragments. Why do you do that? Because you're converting those two carbon fragments into acetyl-CoA. Remember, it's the same molecule that we got from pyruvate. The two carbon, and that goes into then the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. So this is just kind of showing interplay between glucose and triglyceride. So again, let's just stick with the triglyceride. It's coming through lipase. You activate it. Let's say epinephrine and norepinephrine are released either through of your nerves or coming from your glands into the bloodstream, causing that hormone to be active. You start breaking this down into fat, and you release glycerol, and you release these three fatty acids. Let's just look at glycerol real quick. This can actually become 3-phosphoglyceraldehyde. Now again, your head's spinning, I know, if you've not had this, but if you went back and you looked at glycolysis, you will remember that is that intermediate, that 3-carbon intermediate. That's part of glycolysis. So see, you can actually do this. And if this is if you do this in the liver, it can actually go upstream, and this glycerol be converted to glucose. So if you're at rest, you can do this through gluconeogenesis, creating glucose from a non-glucose source. Where else did we see this? All this with lactic acid, right? So there are several intermediates that can actually be converted to glucose during rest, or you can take the 3-phosphoglyceraldehyde and convert it to 1-pyruvate, 1-acetyl-CoA, and on through the citric acid cycle. The big claim to fame for triglyceride is all three of these fatty acids can go into the mitochondria and then start that process by where those scissors start cutting it into multitudes of 2-carbon fragments that form the acetyl-CoA. Now, just again, for those of you who really burning desire to understand this, most triglyceride molecules, the fat chains that are bound to it are 14 to 24 carbons in length. So you can imagine if it's 14, you cut it into 2 carbon fragments, you get 7 of these guys, right? If it's 24, you get 12 of these guys. So you can see the potential energy of doing this is just endless, because of not only if that triglyceride had 3 fatty acid chains and all of them were 20, all 3 of these go in there. Each of them are giving you 10 of these. So you get all of that spinning around to the electron transport. So you can imagine the potential energy for making ATP is just endless. And this is just this example right here is the 3 molecules. If each of them were 18 carbons in length and you went through this whole process, right, and we don't have time to go through all of it, and you added it all up, you'd get 460 ATP molecules compared to the 32 you got from a glucose. So can you see why fats are just so plentiful if the body can get into using them? And I'll tell you, and there's a reason for it, and it's another whole lecture, but when you train, especially train aerobically, you make this process very, very efficient. So most of the acetyl-CoA you're getting is coming from this, not this, which means this metabolism slows down, which is absolutely imperative, because I told you you must always have some glucose/glycogen available even for this to take place. Okay, couple things just to talk about when we think about how do you use fats versus carbohydrates when you exercise. This is kind of like an overview, and what this is looking at is exercise time. So you can see going from rest to, if you would do something for 40 minutes all the way up to 140 minutes, you can see that the percentage of the use of your fuels changes. Okay, so the easiest way to keep this in mind is the longer you exercise, the more you rely on fat. You see how the yellow, the percent goes up with time, and it's going up while the intramuscular glycogen use is down. And in part, this is because it's getting used up. And that's also true by the percent of blood glucose. You can see it's going down. So the longer you exercise, the more your body must rely on fat, the less it's relying on blood glucose and intramuscular glycogen. So that is duration dependent. How about intensity dependent, or how hard you're doing it? All right, so this graph is showing you what happens if you exercise at 25%. So you're just putzing out there. 65%, it's kind of a jog. 85%, now you're kind of hoofing it, right? So energy expenditure, kilocalories per kilogram per minute. You can see that when you are doing it very, very lightly, right, you use mostly fats and a little bit of blood glucose, and very little at all glycogen. Notice that glycogen becomes the predominant substrate with high intensity. At the same time, the use of fat goes down. All right, so kind of review. The longer you exercise, the more fat you use, the less glycogen you use. The harder you exercise, the less fat you use, and the more glycogen you use. All right, so most of you who are athletes who are exercising at 80 to 100%, what does this say? Yep, you can have a lot of potential energy, okay, stored as fat, but you're still relying primarily on that glycogen. So what you ate prior to that exercise is so critically important. All right, now the last thing I'm going to just address in just for a minute or two is proteins. Of our 3 macronutrients, fat, carbohydrates, and proteins, protein should be the least important when it comes to providing ATP. You want proteins. Proteins are always being turned over in your body. They're going into your muscle, they're going out of your muscle. That's the nitrogen balance that takes place. If you are in negative nitrogen balance, you're in a catabolic state and you're using your muscles for energy. If you're in positive nitrogen balance, more protein is going in, less is going out, so you're probably in an anabolic state. Most people don't want to be in a catabolic state. You don't want to eat your muscle for energy, but it will provide energy if necessary. And you can see this is a very, very busy slide, but again, this is our Krebs or citric acid cycle and all the intermediates. Notice all of these amino acids, how they can be converted to various products. It can be converted to acetyl-CoA even before you get there, or it can be converted to different intermediates. So I will tell you that proteins can be used in this energy process. I'm just telling you, you want carbs and fats to be the primary ones. All right, so this is a really kind of neat slide because it's really showing you how all of this is working together. And again, carbohydrates are central to this. And again, you can have plenty of fat and all of this stuff taking place, but without carbohydrates, fats cannot be used as energy. Again, it's a long process. I don't want to get into why it is. Just believe me. I mean, anybody who studied diabetes, and especially people who have type 1 diabetes, which are insulin required, understand that if you don't have insulin, if you go on a hike and you break your last vial of insulin and you're far, far away, you're going to die because the insulin allows the glucose to get into the cell. You must always have some glucose being metabolized for this fat to also be metabolized. And that's the same thing for glucose has metabolized for your proteins. But again, proteins can serve as an important energy substrate if necessary. Normally, I tell students that probably when you exercise, you should be using no more than, of all the ATP that you are forming, it really shouldn't be coming from more than like 5% protein. The rest of it should be coming from carbohydrates and fat. All right. However, how can you make yourself use more protein? Well, I always say don't eat carbs, and that's going to do it. So again, this gets back to that thing I said in the very beginning of the lecture. Why are carbohydrates so important in your diet? Well, this is showing you one of the reasons your body chooses not to use protein is because it's quite expensive. You've got to take off the nitrogen before you can even start the process of using it for energy. So that's called deamination, which takes place primarily in your liver. The muscle can do it a little bit through a transamination process, but it's an energy requiring process, so it's expensive. All right. However, if you don't have carbs or you're not eating carbs in your diet, your body will choose to use more proteins and you'll be in a catabolic state. And this study is showing that. So what they looked at is, remember I said you've got to take the nitrogen off, so you can measure the nitrogen in sweat, you can measure it in fecal matter, etc., etc. So they're looking at how much nitrogen actually showed up in the sweat when people started to exercise, either after eating a lot of carbs or after eating a low carb diet. Now look at this. What is this? 3 times more nitrogen showed up in sweat on the low carb. That tells you you are breaking your proteins down. You're in a catabolic state significantly when you exercise in this low carb state. So again, it's not a smart thing to do. All right, for my last slide is kind of just a summary slide to really go to review. Anytime you exercise, you need ATP, and the first line of defense is creatine phosphate, and you can use the glycogen, you can bring glucose in, we can use triglycerides, or you can actually get some carbons, skeletons from your amino acids. We went through all that. So this is what's needing all of that. The 2 main areas that this is coming from, I guess we could say 3. There's a little tiny bit of all that being stored in the muscle, but by and large, the most important for all of this liver. The liver is the primary organ that regulates blood glucose, and it does it through either storing the glucose as glycogen, or as we talked about, taking up non-glucose sources and through gluconeogenesis converting it to glucose, then bringing it back to the muscle. But don't forget the very, very important and very powerful energy substrate, potential energy that fat has. And anytime we can dive into this, we get to conserve our glucose, and training does this significantly. It does it because it increases our vascular supply, it increases the amount of blood we have, it increases the amount of mitochondria in the muscle that uses the fat. There's a whole lot of things going on when you train that allow you to use more of this and conserve this glucose for the brain. But it ultimately converts, all of this stuff converts to the mitochondria. All right, with the exception of the few processes I told you happen in the cytosol, in the anaerobic process, over 90% of all ATP is produced through the electron transport in the inner part of the mitochondria. I hope it made some sense, and that you have some idea of where energy comes from for muscle contraction. Please feel free to reach out to us anytime if you want to talk about the program of exercise physiology, or if there's anything we can do to help you in your studies in high school and then as you matriculate into college.